Okay, I think we can start now. This webinar will be recorded, and I'm happy to say hello to everyone joining us live for the 55 number 55 webinar of the Philanthropy Chair on flexible and unrestricted funding in philanthropy. I'm really happy to say a few words first about the housekeeping rules for the webinar. So for those of you who know our webinars, it's very straightforward, but I will give you a few indications. So first, all microphones are muted now. You can unmute yourself when we'll have questions for our participants or guests. The cameras are on. You can please put your cameras on. It's nice to see all your faces. And also, I think it's nice if you can rename yourself so we can see your full name and maybe your organization in brackets. So you can do that easily by doing a right click on your name to show who is in the room. That would be nice. So for questions to our guests, you can write them directly in the chat if you want throughout the webinar. And we will have ample time for questions also, so you could also raise your hand and we'll give you the mic to ask your questions. As I said, this webinar is recorded. As usual, we will broadcast it on our YouTube channel, so you can have access to it and after the event. Okay, so thank you again to our participants. It's time now to introduce the topic and our guests. Today we will talk about the notion of flexible and unrestricted funding in philanthropy. Well, there's no single definition of what this is. Flexible or unrestricted funding can be used by nonprofit organizations to fund their general operations, invest in their organizational capacity, or have unusual activities during crises. And this type of funding is quite essential for nonprofit organizations, especially in some difficult times like we know today. And this idea of losing up the restrictions on grants actually is quite opposed to the long tradition of earmarking donations and grants to specific projects or programs in nonprofit organizations. Usually restrictions apply in how these grants and donations can be used by the recipients. We will today talk about what unrestricted and flexible funding is, what it does also to both the philanthropic funder and the recipient, the nonprofit organization receiving the funds. We will also talk about I would say the benefits, but also maybe the weaknesses of this approach, what it tells us about the current questions about the role of philanthropy and its capacity to intervene to help social innovators and social enterprises on the ground. We will share data on that and also key questions pertaining to this type of funding. So to talk about this issue, I'm really happy to welcome two distinguished guests for that. First, Nelson Amaya from the Jacobs Foundation. Hello, Nelson. Nelson is the Global Knowledge Manager at the Jacobs Foundation, and he has a long experience as an economist and policy analyst on the field of foundations and global philanthropy. He used to work for the OECD Center on Philanthropy and co-lead author on the No Strings Attached OECD study in 2024, which really tackled this topic. And the other guest for this webinar is Arjen de Wit. Arjen, hello. Arjen is an assistant professor at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and part of the leading Center for Nonprofit Studies, which is a long-standing center studying private giving in the Netherlands. Arjen has worked quite strongly on unrestricted funding in recent years. publishing this paper that we mentioned on the screen with Pamela Witking in the Nonprofit Management and Leadership Review. So we will share the resources on the chat. I'm really happy to have our two guests. So thank you both for joining us, for having this conversation. Before leaving the floor maybe to Ariane first, I would like you to answer a first poll that we prepared for you. So the goal here is to see what is your relationship as participants to this notion of flexible and unrestricted funding. So you will see the first poll show on your screen now. And the question is the following: does your organization receive or allocate unrestricted flexible funding? And if so, what percentage of your total funds does this type of funding represent? So whether you work in a nonprofit organizations receiving philanthropic funds, or if you work in a foundation or in a grant-making organization, you can answer this poll. And so, are you used to having this type of funding in your organization? And if so, what percentage of your total funds does this type of funding represent? So I will leave you just a few seconds to answer before we share the results with everyone. So I think some of you have not voted yet, but I think we can share the results now. It's interesting to see that most of you answered that almost all the funding is unrestricted, which is, wow, it's quite surprising. The second part is the opposite. Almost all funding is earmarked for 28% of the voters. So that's interesting. We have about the two extremes represented in the room. That's super interesting. So now I think is the good time to ask Ariane maybe to share his screen, and we can start with the first presentation. Ariane, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Arthur, for this great introduction, and I'm happy to be here and to talk with all of you about this important topic that we indeed have been studying in Amsterdam for a few years now, and happy to join also Nelson in the conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of in-house knowledge in this webinar, so I'm also really looking forward to the discussion. And after I tell a bit about what we did on this topic. I will indeed talk a little bit about the definition of unrestricted funding and the context of it, and then mainly my talk will be on the consequences of unrestricted funding for the receiving organizations. So indeed, what are the possible benefits, but also maybe the disadvantages of it, and then ending with some ideas for suggestions for practice. So this is. This is joint work. We have a Center for Grant-Making Research, which is actually a branch of the Center for Philanthropic Studies in Amsterdam. Pamela Witking was already mentioned as the co-author or the lead author of this study that we did, and was published in the Nonprofit Management and Leadership Journal. On the left-hand side on the screen. And then we also work with Wallace Watson and Eline Krins, and actually there's also another research assistant. So we have a small team now working on grant making, mainly on the topic of unrestricted funding, but we're also studying participatory grant making, and possibly also other new forms of or forms of grant making. But we started out with mainly studying what are the consequences of unrestricted funding. So the topic of flexible or unrestricted funding fits in like this broader philosophy or grant-making strategy of trust-based philanthropy. These kind of elements of trust-based philanthropy come from the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, which I think is based or at least originated in California. And it consists of these elements. Like, it's not only multi-year unrestricted funding, which is an important element for sure, but it's also other things in terms of accountability and building a relationship between funder and grantee, like doing your homework, minimalizing the reporting pressure on grantees, being open and transparent, building a relationship, being open to feedback on how your organization works, on both sides actually, and providing support and resources as a funder, and which is also a partner that organizations need. So it's more than just money, and unrestricted funding is a very important element of this grant making strategy, but it's not the only thing. Unrestricted funding then, as such, relates to other concepts like core funding, which is more explicitly based at or targeted at strengthening the organization. So that can also be like what's called general operating support or things like that, which or capacity funding, which is actually the second related concept in this slide, or organizational funding. So these are more, at least in the name, explicitly targeted at building the organization, strengthening the organization, whereas full-on unrestricted funding can be spent on anything like programs, but also into the organization. And Arthur already mentioned, like, there is no single definition. Maybe Nelson can also relate a bit to that about how he places unrestricted and flexible funding in relation to other types of grant making. We at the center see unrestricted and flexible funding as the same thing. It's unearmarked, but at the same time, it's not a dichotomy, right? It's not like that funding is either unrestricted or it is restricted. So we tend to think about it as this scale, in which you have on the left-hand side the typical project funding, which, like Arthur already explained, is kind of the default in the sector now. And then on the right-hand side, you have fully unrestricted funding, which is unearmarked, which has no restrictions on where it is spent, when it is spent, how it is spent. But there is like other types in between, like unrestricted program funding, in which like there is a theme or a program in which the funding should fit. But within that theme or within that program, there is flexibility in how to spend it. Or there is a certain project in which there is funding, but there is more flexibility in how the partners within that project spend the money. Typically, then there is like a time frame or something like that. So there is some restrictions, but within that project there is more flexibility. And then different parts of the little bit more unrestricted funding can be organizational funding or core funding. So we see that as another dimension actually. It can be targeted at, for example, a project funding can be targeted at the program itself and expenses within the program, but can also be partly maybe dedicated for building and strengthening the organizational capacity to actually run that project effectively. So this is, I think, a good thing. We can discuss about what actually flexible or unrestricted funding is and whatnot, but I think it's good to think about it as a scale and not as a dichotomy. And then maybe about this, one more thing is that, of course, there's different types of restrictions, right? There is like the time frame, or there is the geographical scale, or there is the project, or the theme it should fit in. So there's also, of course, different types of restrictions. Oh, I think Nelson will actually can tell a bit, like a lot more actually about the numbers, of how many grants are restricted or unrestricted. It's funny to see that the sample in this webinar seems to lean a bit more towards unrestricted funding, which is interesting. But this is a figure from a paper from the Center for Effective Philanthropy in the US. in which they asked foundations that will whether they will continue providing unrestricted grants after the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually, a lot of them, at least in that survey question, intended to continue providing more unrestricted support than they did before the COVID-19 pandemic. It's of course the question whether they really followed up on it and then how much. Because if you look at a survey that we did in the Netherlands among foundations, a disclaimer here, this is not a representative survey. There's just like 58 foundations that participated in the survey. So I don't claim that this is what it looks like in the Netherlands, but it gives some idea. There we asked funders or foundations how much of the, or whether they provided different types of funding. So whether they did project-based funding, whether they did core funding targeted at the organization, or whether they did fully unrestricted funding. And those were not mutually exclusive, right? Because as an organization, you can, of course, do different types of grants. And you also see that you see that project-based funding is most popular one, but still 12% of foundations also say that they do unrestricted funding, which is quite, still more than 1 out of 10. But if you then look at what percentage of the grants, like was also in the poll that Arthur shared, what percentage of the grants then is unrestricted, then you see that 80%, almost 80% of the grants of the money that is spent is project based, and only like 7% is or 4% unrestricted funding, and 3% is some other type of funding. I'm not sure what that would look like. Maybe some investments or so. But the number 4% actually nuances the previous figure a little bit, that in terms of how much of the philanthropic grants go to unrestricted or are flexible is not so big. At least in this sample, in this survey question. And again, I think Nelson can add a bit more numbers about this. A bit of context about why you should do unrestricted funding. Maybe many of you know the nonprofit starvation cycle, in which the idea is that funders have unrealistic expectations about project costs, and then mainly about how many indirect costs are necessary to run a project and to run an organizations. Organizations respond to that by trying to keep funders satisfied and to try to satisfy these expectations. So in their grant proposals and reporting, they indeed report low overhead costs and underreport the real costs, which actually fuel the unrealistic expectations that were already in place. So the idea of this cycle is that it's a continuous cycle in which unrealistic ideas that live among funders are fueled by the way that grantee organizations apply and respond to their funders. And well, the idea of the starvation cycle is that it can actually lead to organizations to become to have real problems in terms of surviving. Actually, I'm not sure we don't really see this at least not in Europe as I know of, that organizations really die because of these problematic overload. But maybe there are some examples of that. But it is problematic that organizations need money to run the organization and run projects, and that many funders don't really see that according to this starvation cycle. So now going a bit to the studies that we did in the center, we started with a big grant, which is still our main grant from the Dutch postcode lottery, which is an interesting case because since its foundation in 1989, they are providing multi-year unrestricted grants. That was actually part of their grant-making philosophy from the start off. They were founded by a man coming from the international development sector, who was really frustrated about this problem of funders doing only projects and this project cycle. So he decided to start a charity lottery in which people would play with their postcode as a lottery ticket. So if you win, your neighbors also win. which turned out to be a very successful marketing idea. And now it is there is like millions of people in the Netherlands playing with the charity lottery. So they are also able to grant a lot of money to organizations in the Netherlands and abroad by the revenues from the lottery sales. And so they're fixed, or the main part of their grants are multi-year and unrestricted, and they're funding the same organizations for years and years. Which is an interesting case. So we did interviews with partners of that of different types of postcode lotteries, and then in the last few years we also collaborated with two other foundations in the Netherlands, Kansfonds, who started doing unrestricted support. Actually, it's more like organization support, I would say, to 75 homeless centers. Were applying every time, and then they found out, maybe it's better if we just continue giving them unrestricted funding, because we know what they do and we like what they do. We find it important. We just have to support them, which saves time on both sides, was the idea. And then Oranje Fonds is a kind of a hybrid foundation doing both fundraising and having an endowment. They are working mainly in social welfare, and they are doing a pilot now with unrestricted support for a small number of organizations they already knew, to see how that works for them. So I think this is quite typical, right? That some foundations are kind of piloting or experimenting with unrestricted funding, which is also interesting for us as researchers to see how that goes and what are the consequences of that, or the effects of that. So the paper that was also in the kind of the title slide that was published last year. I put some QR codes here, but I think there will also be resources shared in the chat, so then you can also link to the article itself. But this article was based on a study that we did with partners from the Dutch Postcode Lottery, which are mainly slightly bigger organizations, I would say, kind of established nonprofit organizations working in different fields, international development, nature and environment, health, and also social welfare. So there's quite a mix of types of organizations that we studied, with the idea, what are the effects of this multi-year unrestricted funding for the organizations. And the aim was to kind of classify those effects into a conceptual model. And this is the model we came up with. So on the left-hand side, you see unrestricted funding, or like I said, it's a scale, right? So there might be gradations of unrestricted funding. On the right-hand side, there is nonprofit effectiveness, which is actually why an organization is on Earth. The extent to which an organization reaches its goals. And in the middle is the thing that we focused on, so the nonprofit capacity. So what in the organization is needed to actually be effective, to actually reach the goals. We all know the term nonprofit capacity, but in the literature, it already had been said that this is multidimensional. There is different elements of capacity, and why wouldn't we speak of multiple capacities? So we followed up on that idea and adopted a number of capacities from previous studies, mainly work by Schumate and colleagues, who made like a nonprofit capacities instrument, which is a survey that you can run among organizations to see how they score on different capacities. But then we looked how those capacities fit in the idea of how an organization benefits, or maybe not benefits, from unrestricted funding. And actually, we found a few more capacities that were not in the original instrument, and also made a few adaptations in terms of what the capacities mean. I will go through them, through the 7 of them, and also have some quotes from our interviews on some capacities. So starting with the first one is financial management, and that's, I think, the most obvious benefit of unrestricted funding, right? That we think of like that you can have a buffer in between projects, that you have can build up a little bit of reserve to overcome problematic times, and that is, I think, maybe the most important one. And a danger here is, especially with a large funder like the Dutch Postcode Lottery is, that grantees become too dependent of this one stream of multi-year unrestricted funding. Because if you use those grants to run your organization and to run the back office and to overcome gaps between projects, then you're also really dependent on that stream of money. So that's why in left to the arrow, there is a plus for the benefits of unrestricted funding, but there is also a minus of a possible downside of it, and that is the dependency that organizations can get from it. The second capacity is operational capacity. And that relates to the back office of an organization, how well you can run your back office, have in-house knowledge, personnel that you can tie to your organization for the long term, and that you really need to, not only run that one specific project, but also to do the fundraising, do research on the topic that you're working on, and so on. So here's a quote from one respondent saying that, maybe you have someone with you for 3 years and at some point they have to leave because the project is finished. And in that period, they build up a lot of knowledge. So if you have no unrestricted funds at all, then you become a sort of a lobbying club on communication without really having the expertise in-house. But that's precisely our strength. So if you have multi-year unrestricted funding, then you can build up that knowledge and be much stronger on the topic that you're working on. And that also benefits, of course, fundraising for to other funders and to projects, because then you have the knowledge to actually write better grants and to show that you're a strong organization in that area. The staff management relates to how well you can equip and train your personnel to their work effectively. And here you see in the arrow on the left-hand side a plus, but also a 0, because actually in that sample of organizations, we did not find such strong indications that unrestricted funding really helps with that. At least in the organizations that we spoke to. We spoke to like 20 organizations or so. And you see that also in this quote. So they say, yeah, of course we do that training and education of our personnel and our volunteers, but I don't know if that necessarily comes from the money from the Dutch Postcode Lottery. I don't know. If it wasn't there, I don't think we would stop facilitating training or something like that. So, and that's what's actually echoed by many respondents, that training and equipping the staff is something that they do, but is not really affected by unrestricted funding. However, we know from also studies on the grantees of Mackenzie Scott in the US, which is also, of course, a very big unrestricted giver, that there is some effects on these things. So it's unsure here. So, and that holds for this whole model, that I see it as a kind of we started, building this from literature review and those 20 interviews, but it's kind of a work in progress. And, if you look at different contexts and different funders and different organizations, the effects might be different. Adaptive capacity relates to flexibility to adapt to the environment, changes in society and politics. It's also mentioned in this quote of this respondent. Opportunities like Corona, COVID pandemic, and the momentum that presents itself. If we always had to apply for that and then deliver everything exactly as we had requested, we can't do our work. And this seems to hold more for organizations in the field of international development and cooperation, and in the field of nature and environment, a bit more than in health and welfare, for example. Strategic planning relates to how well an organization can make strategic plans and carry those out, and that those plans are also supported in the whole organization. Here we asked someone about lobbying. The respondent said we can't find funding for lobbying. And then we as interviewers said, so that doesn't contribute to the goal or so. And then the rest respondent said, yeah, it does, because it's important for us, but it's not a project with a clear beginning and end. So we can't really say that to funders or present that to funders. Then there is with strategic planning also a possible downside, and that is that organizations might become a bit less critical to how they spend the money. And that is actually, I think, also a fear that funders have. And actually, one respondent actually said that. So if I'm honest, I think that if we have earmarked funding, we learn to be critical on ourselves about what we actually achieve in this project. And that might be less the case for unrestricted funding. So this is a possible danger, I think, of unrestricted funds. Mission orientation is that you don't follow funder priorities, but you do truly what is needed and are not donor driven, which is very important for organizations that work in, for example, countries with an authoritarian government, or they work in more contested areas. Also can also be in the environmental area, for example, that you don't want to be donor driven, but to be independent in how you do your mission and how you do your projects. And with unrestricted funding, you can. And then innovation is a new one that came up from the interviews, in which some respondents said that there are certain innovations for which you can get money in the beginning, the developing the idea. You might also get money when it's really evidence-based and proven and you want to scale up. But in the middle, the messy middle, it's hard to get financing for that. And if you have a decent amount of unrestricted funds, you can also fund that. Those innovative ideas. So many possible benefits, but there's also concerns living around accountability, around the impact of it, and about how we as funders, how you as a funder gonna structure and carry that out. I'm also looking a bit to the time. I won't make it too long. I want to say one word about impact, and I think that impact is something else than just counting the outcomes. I think in the sector, often when we talk about impact and those reports about impact, then it's about, we reached so many participants and so many people saw our project or participated in our initiative. But that's not necessarily what impact is. Impact is much more how you change the world and how the world looks like if because you were there and in relation to a hypothetical world and you wouldn't be there. That is what impact is, and that's very hard or maybe even impossible to measure. So I'm always careful about using the word impact. Some suggestions then to end with for funders. If you have a mission talking about impact, that's like very idealistic and trying to tackle a wicked problem, solve world poverty, or end climate change, or a very ambitious goal, ambitious mission. Think about which form of funding best aligns with that mission. Because again, if you just fund a project with some specific outcomes, is that really the most effective in reaching that broad mission? If you want to try out a new funding model with more flexible types of funding, try it out first on small scale. Be aware of power imbalances. So that also relates to the fifth point. A danger here is, I think, that funders tend to look at organizations that they already know and trust, which they want to start with funding in a more flexible and long-term way. which makes sense. But the danger is then that some more smaller grassroots organizations without a proper network in place fall out of the funding even more. So this inequality in the sector is something to be aware of. And for fundraising organizations, think about your funding portfolio, not only in terms of diversity, in terms of the number of types of sources, but also in how restricted, unrestricted these sources are. It might help to engage with acquaintances, funders, or other partners that you already know. Say what you want to achieve and communicate this. And start with small steps, also in asking for more flexible funding. Maybe your partners are interested in doing that, but you don't know if you haven't started the conversation. And as a last point, put your money where your mouth is. Holds for organizations that receive money, but also re-grant money. You often see that organizations do receive flexible funding, but then re-grant that into projects. And that's not putting your money where your mouth is, actually. This is it. We have this website, grantmakingresearch.nl. I think we share some resources in the chat. We are grateful to especially the postcode lottery for funding our research, but also Kansfonds and Oranje Fonds, who are partners. And yeah, I think I didn't put my email in the slides, but I think it's just a public. So if you follow the resources, you'll also find my email. We're always happy to engage more in conversations about this, and of course happy to join the discussion here in the webinar.
Thank you so much, Arjen, for this. It was really interesting to see the results of your work at the center, and also remind us of the definitions. Before we move on to Nelson's presentation, I think we already have a few interesting questions on the chat. I think the first question was from Marie-Stéphane. Do you want to say it out loud, Marie-Stéphane, maybe? It would be easier. I think it's a great point we need to address.
Thank you very much, Aaron. It was very interesting. Actually, I read your paper already, but it's always interesting to get back to it. My question was about the combination of unrestricted funding and multi-year funding, and to see if you have seen a difference in the impact towards the capacities of the NPOs between the two, the only unrestricted funding and the combination of unrestricted plus multi-year funding. Do you see any difference?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. I think what we saw, that many of the benefits that I showed in the model are there is partly because it is multi-year, because organizations can really think long term and think about the strategic planning, and like I said, hire personnel that really benefits the organization, and also the fundraising for projects. So indeed, I think there the long-term part, or the multi-year part, is actually very important in benefiting the organization. On the other hand, some of the possible downsides are also more likely when it's like a multi-year grant, right? Becoming too dependent of it and becoming less critical of your own work. That I think will happen more if you're used, which is the case for the grantees of the postcode lottery. Some are grantees for decades already, and they might become so used to that. They incorporate that in their organization, and yeah, then it's really hard to downscale that again or stop that again. So what is the exit strategy then? And also the inequality maybe in the sector, when you start doing multi-year funding to some organizations, you also fix your money to those organizations, and then instead of funding maybe 50 smaller organizations, you fund 5 or 10 specific ones, which then may increase inequality maybe. So I see benefits of the multi-year aspect of it, but also possible downsides.
You. Well, I think just to comment on that, I think that maybe the focus is not the same. I mean, if you are doing multi-year unrestricted, you might see your organization as kind of actors of change, of systemic change, rather than if you are funding 50 different organizations, it's much more on a short term in order to, just to cure some symptoms of problems and not the roots of them.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
No, that's true. Yeah, and like Mackenzie Scott again, that's just a one-off grant, right? That organization, but she also, funds like more smaller grassroots organization, and then the story might also be a bit different because then they might, even if it's just a one shot grant, they might just do a few things. I don't know, maybe hire a fundraiser for a short period of time, to get some ideas of how to effectively fundraise. That might just be that propeller actually to accelerate your organization. So maybe for smaller grassroots organizations, it might actually be enough to just have like a one-shot grant.
Thank you, Ariane, for your answer. Maybe we have time for a final short question to Ariane before we move on. I saw a great question from Pierre Arnold. I suggest to take it at the end of the seminar when we have also listened to Nelson. The question was from Vanessa. Could you clarify, Ariane, the translation of what unrestricted means in Dutch? That's a very precise question. And also maybe clarify the difference between, I think, project and program funding. Are these like synonyms or in your, in typology that you outline?
Right. I think in Dutch we would say vrij besteedbaar for unrestricted. But you could also say unearmarked, like ongeoormerkt. And the difference between project and program funding, I think, project is really like you have an initiative for a school to buy tablets for the kids there, right? That's a project. But the program is more improving education in poor neighborhoods or so. That's a program that an organization might run with different programs in there. So if you project in there, so if you would give program funding, you say, I want to help your organization with improving education in poor neighborhoods, and you see how you do that, right? I would say that's like an unrestricted program grant. But if you say, okay, we have specific ideas about where and how the project is done, that would be a project. So that's how I see it. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that, Ariane. Very clear. Thank you. Okay, great. Now it's time to send the second poll for our webinar. So I encourage all of you to vote to this second question before we listen to Nelson. So the question is the following: why is unrestricted or flexible funding still a marginal practice among philanthropic funders? We ask you for your opinion. Why do you think, what do you think is the main reason? You have, I think, one choice here. Why do you think this type of funding is still marginal among, grant-making practices of philanthropic funders? So take a few seconds to read the different answers. Why do you think is unrestricted and flexible funding still marginal among funding practices? So let's wait a few more seconds to let everyone vote. You have 5 different choices. That's very interesting. Okay, almost 50 of you have voted now, so I think we can share the results now, so everybody can see. Interestingly, the first answer is difficulty in evaluating how funds are used by the recipient. Since it's not earmarked to a specific project or program, evaluating the use of funds is the main challenge according to you. And the second main reason cited was a lack of understanding of the realities on the ground, meaning that some funders may resist engaging this type of flexible funding because they don't really understand the needs of their grantees. And finally, the third, it's much it's much less cited, but established norms and practices and concerns about opportunistic behavior come behind. But yeah, difficulty in evaluating and lack of understanding of the realities on the ground. Thank you so much for voting. I think now it's time to welcome Nelson and to give him the floor. So Nelson, again, thank you so much for joining, and the floor is yours.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, wonderful. And can everybody see the screen? Is a confirmation?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Okay, that's great. So I'm very happy, Arthur. Thank you for the invitation, and to Arjun. I think this discussion is like we needed to have it like 3 years ago, because it can evolve and has already evolved in so many interesting directions that it's very important that we all the time try to kind of polish the questions that we're asking about this topic, because every time we find something, we usually open up just bigger and more important questions rather than answering everything. And this is basically what I want to do today. I want to basically tell you a little bit about kind of my perspective on this topic, wearing two different hats. So as Arthur mentioned, I prepared a report at the OECD last year that took a very deep look and a very kind of data heavy look into restricted funding at a global level, with thousands of grants and hundreds, well, not hundreds, but I think 180 grantees from all over the world. So it gave us a very, very nice picture about what we think happens in the sector. But it also left me with kind of with a lot of questions. So I think we answered some of the questions satisfactorily, but there were others that I think we never managed to answer, and we need to pay a lot more attention to those. So basically what I want to discuss today is three things. The first one is why I believe we need to reframe the discussion on flexible funding. So, and basically I'm going to tell you why I don't have a very good opinion of trust-based philanthropy. You can say, Nelson, you're crazy. How come you disagree with trust-based philanthropy? Are you against trust? And I am not, but I will tell you that as soon as you scratch the surface of trust-based philanthropy, you see a lot of problems in that formulation that need a little bit more of attention. The second part is I'm going to draw a little bit on the results from this paper, because I expect here nobody read it. So I'm going to give you the brief summary of the findings and kind of the things that we found super interesting in this research. I think they're worthy of your attention. And give you also the spoiler to the story, which is the real story is about contracts. The real story in flexible funding happens at the contractual level. Right now, I work for the Jacobs Foundation, and we are not traditional grant makers. We are very operational and very involved directly in the foundation in all of the operations, even if they are abroad. So the traditional story of flexible funding is very much portrayed as there's a donor and there's a grantee, and there's a hierarchical relationship between the two. But the reality of the sector is that it's much more complicated than that. And we need to be able to account for all of these different ways of operating to understand the issue a little bit more. And finally, I'm going to put some of those unanswered questions with the hope that somebody raises their hand and goes like, ooh, I really want to answer that question now. I cannot answer it anymore. I'm not doing that research anymore, but I do think that there are lots of open questions that need to be answered still. And I want you to think about two things. Basically two ideas that basically frame almost everything that I'm going to say today. The first one is that if we are not asking the right questions, we are not at all approximating the things that we really want. And it's very, very easy to get really good and really precise answers about the wrong question. If we're only asking the particular grantees who already receive flexible funding or who don't receive flexible funding, we're going to get a biased view of what there actually is happening in the sector. If we only ask the donors who are providing unflexible funding, then we actually don't understand what are the restrictions and what are kind of the lessons that the other donors are actually putting into their contracts, because they are very practical people, and they also need to know that some conditionality needs to apply to the type of contractual financial restrictions that apply to grants and to all different types of financial operations that happen in philanthropy. And this leads me to my other point, which is anything that can be asserted without evidence can be also dismissed without evidence. So you really need to bring very good and very well substantiated arguments on evidence related to philanthropy for me to believe these claims. And you'll see why this is actually resonate to this discussion. So why do we need to reframe this discussion? As I mentioned, there's this idea in the philanthropic sector that this is how the sector operates, that you have a hierarchical relationship where a donor has very specific relationships with each of their grantees, and that this relationship is hierarchical, that this relationship is basically one directional, that this relationship is full of confusion and full of even misinformation. One of the great points of Arjun's presentation was this miscommunication of the overheads, like this idea of what are really your operational fixed costs, and this inability of grantees to be honest about those costs, because a lot of the donors put very heavy restrictions into their overhead costs. But this is a caricature. The real way that the sector operates is much more complicated than that. There are multiple interactions between different donors. There are also interactions with official donors, with government donors that operate as sometimes co-funders, or that operate even as operators of the funds that are provided by private donors. Also, another great point from Arjun is that there are a lot of intermediary organizations and regranters who play a very important role in the sector. We can discuss a little bit later what that role is, but they also play a very important role in adding additional restrictions along the way to flexible funding. So sometimes they receive the flexibility from a particular donor, but they don't pass it through when they regrant. And I find that very problematic. And there are also many different types of grantees themselves. So I think we really need to see the sector for what it is, instead for what we kind of want it to be, or kind of the different caricatures of the sector that you can see sometimes. And this is why I believe that we have to have a much more contractual and practical view of flexible funding question. Yield giving has appeared a few times, and we talked about trust-based philanthropy. And the yield giving is one of the fastest disbursement operations in the history of philanthropy. It's been a little over 3 years with a disbursement of almost $20 billion. But I gotta tell you, and they're actually operating precisely under the trust-based philanthropy mantra. But this is a very problematic mantra. Just to give you an example of why this is the case, I actually went to the website because it's fully open and you can actually download all of the 2,000 and something grants they have dispersed so far. And I realized that as of April, when I put together this presentation, 90% of all of the funds have gone to very large US-based organizations or to very large international nonprofits. So this, and I have to give a hat to Simon Sommer, the co-CEO of the Jacobs Foundation, who warned about this potential problem very early in 2022, that if the mantra of trust-based philanthropy carries on, all of the organizations who are actually going to receive the unrestricted funds are those organizations that everybody already trusts, and it's going to starve the entire sector. It's going to create such an increase and concentration of inequalities that probably we have never seen before. And that was right there in this quite controversial article, but I think time proved him right. Simon had 3 arguments back then of why there were problems with the idea of trust-based philanthropy. Number 1, trust-based philanthropy assumes the existence of trust. It doesn't show how trust is created, built, and maintained. And when that assumption actually is taken very lightly, without a lot of skepticism, that basically means that the only organizations who are to be trusted are those that are already trusted by everybody else. And which are those organizations? Those organizations are long-established nonprofits who have been working maybe for decades, and they actually crowd out entirely the space for all others. And this leads to preferential attachment. This idea that those that receive funding because of their own conditions will tend to receive more funding because of those conditions persist. He also presented other arguments, which I really recommend that you read this article because it was very controversial when it came back then. But I remember reading it and saying, like, this is it's on point. There are lots of problems when you really scratch the surface of trust-based philanthropy. And another problem is that this is also a very US-centric perspective, because not every place and not all of the organizations that receive funding from the philanthropic sector need to have this constant and perpetual maintenance into their capacities, but they are basically in agreement to deliver a common objective with the donor. So that again, I won't go through all of the arguments, but in general, I think the important thing that the entire discussion of trust-based philanthropy completely missed is that trust is a relationship rooted in risk, and trust actually works in a very known way. Like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Trust is an act that somebody places on somebody else that makes them vulnerable. A donor provides funding upfront for a particular project for another grantee to be able to manage. The grantee can actually pay back that trust and build a relationship by demonstrating and reciprocating on that act of trust. And usually that involves a cost. That involves effort, that involves being able to deliver the actual things that were agreed upon. And this relationship circles back and it's maintained and improved through time. So the entire discussion of trust-based philanthropy is completely misguided because it assumes away how trust is built and how trust is maintained. And once you ignore that, what actually has happened is that all of the organizations that are very well established and that are happy to be trustworthy organizations are the ones who are basically vacuuming all of the funds in the sector and leaving very little space for others to actually blossom. So I also would like to recommend this book by an economist, Benjamin Ho, that gives a very, very clean and clear treatment of trust. And we should be moving in understanding the real issues in the sector related to trust in a much more principled way, instead of just assuming away all of the main points. So I do think that we need to start asking the right questions. We're not asking the right questions. The questions should not be like whether grantees feel that they're not trusted enough, whether grantees need more multi-year flexible funding. Where I think we have to move away from those questions, because those questions are not really leading us anywhere. These questions that we think can be reframed and we can understand them much better are related to when does flexible funding make sense. Something that has come through several times is that I don't think there's a single organization that does all flexible funding or all on earmarked funding. There's always a combination of both. Like, every organization has a mixture of flexible and non-flexible funding depending on what they do, whatever suits the purpose of that particular program, project, initiative, or whatever they do. So when does it make sense? Under which conditions it makes sense to put conditions, and under which conditions it makes sense to lift them. The other important one is who actually gives flexibly and why do they do it? Do they have a strategy? Do they lack a strategy? Do they know what they want to accomplish? Do they have absolutely no idea why they do it? Very interestingly, who gets flexible funding is very important, because we also already know from the example of yield giving that I just gave, is that if only those organizations that could signal to all others that they're worthy of their trust, those are the ones who receive that. But what about all the others who are not able to do that? Another example, why, for instance, a hypothesis that we had when we worked in this paper is that if a particular grantee has multiple objectives or works in multiple sectors, then that's an incentive for a particular donor to give them earmarked funding, because a lot of donors have very specific kind of guardrails into what they can do and what they cannot do. So, for instance, Arjen mentioned in his presentation several times that a lot of grantees say that they can't have funding for lobbying. A lot of donors are prohibited from giving any funding that is related to lobbying. So you really can't give to an organization that says that they do lobbying, even if you want to support their work, because if they use your resources that you gave them for lobbying, you are going to get into trouble as a donor. So there are very important reasons, practical ones, on why this happens. Another important one, because I used to work on philanthropy for development, basically all of this funding, how it really goes to developing countries, is to what extent is this issue of trust something that kind of puts a bigger restriction on funds moving to the places that are probably needed the most. So how is this even trust-based philanthropy idea discriminating against all the NGOs in the developing world, because they're very, very hard for them to be able to reach the right networks and get funding from them. And as I also mentioned, the issue of intermediaries. Once you put a single dollar or a franc or a euro into, like, from the moment that it leaves a donor to the moment that it benefits somebody somewhere, it's almost like a leaky bucket. There are many intermediary organizations along the way. And it's very important to be aware of the role that they play, and especially in the role of adding additional constraints along the way that sometimes the donor actually doesn't want. So that's a discussion for a little later. So I'm going to now walk you through the results of the paper from last year, so you don't have to read it. It's very short. Nevertheless, I'm going to give you a very brief review of what we found. So I'm very happy we even got away with putting this cover in an OECD report, because I think it signaled exactly what we wanted to put. But in general, the framing that we included here is to basically really understand, what do the donors want, what do the grantees want, and sometimes what are the solutions that come out of their disagreements. So donors, for instance, they don't want to pay for all of the fixed costs of their grantees. They don't want to pay for their light bills or their salaries or their training. For a single donor doesn't want to have all of the costs, because another donor can actually give that same organization a lot of flexible funding, and they will get the credit for whatever actually happens afterwards. So it's problematic. But grantees also need room to breathe. And I actually think that the entire trust-based philanthropy movement was just basically a way for the entire sector to face to the reality that donors sometimes put absurd restrictions into and absurd clauses into their grants. So there has to be a combination of this. What other things actually can happen here? Wait, give me a second, because I lost my... Wait. I changed Windows and I can't parse through my presentation. Let me just unshare it and reshare it again.
Yeah, no problem. In any case, we also have a backup if need be.
No, it's okay. Let me just give me a second and I'll go here. Can you see it again? Okay.
Yes.
There's also, for instance, and here I have an amazing anecdote of one thing that the last thing I learned at the OECD. I had the opportunity to interview very large foundations on what they did differently during COVID. And I won't name the foundation, but in one of these interviews, I was interviewing somebody that was an executive of the foundation, and I asked them, like, wait, how is it that you're becoming a lot more flexible in your grant making? And they turned around in the interview and said, like, we actually realized, if it were not for COVID, that we were putting the same restrictions and the same due diligence to a $50,000 grant than to a $20 million grant. That we had kind of put handcuffs on ourselves with a very silly internal processes, and only facing the shock of needing to very quickly disperse during COVID. If we hadn't faced that shock, we probably would continue to be in that very silly little world. Reporting requirements. Foundations spend a lot of time asking for things that sometimes they don't even review. Like, sometimes when you see the reporting requirements in the systems of foundations, they are just a little bit absurd. But in general, my point here is that all of these tensions are easily understood through a contract view. Like, basically, what happens when donors and grantees work together for a same objective. And there are kind of, in general, two types of donors. There are donors who are choosers, and there are donors who have a much more involved view on their contracting. So a lot of, for instance, the yield giving, the McKinsey cases, they were selectors. They were not involved at all with what the actual organization was actually doing. So for them, their entire job was be able to select the right organization. We now know that this selection incurred a lot of problems because of what I already mentioned. But then there are other organizations that are much more involved in the deployment of their funds, who basically need to put into their contracts how to align all of these difficult incentives and all of these tensions between themselves and their partners, so that they can actually get the things done that kind of maximizes the objectives for both of them. So this is basically the view that we took in this paper, which we think is much more practical, is much clearer. It speaks to kind of the different types of donors that exist, and also pays down to all the tensions that we actually see in the sector. So let me walk you through a couple of the results from this paper. The first one is that, as we have already discussed, when we looked at all of these thousands of grants from lots of donors deployed in 60-something countries, we found that the fraction of flexible funding that we measured by looking at the specific grants and looking for combinations of words that relate to core funding or general or for general purpose support, or all of these combinations of words, we found it to be very, very small. And basically, this speaks to the billions of dollars. So what do we know? That when these big operations or this big funding actually passes through, strings are attached along the way. There are very few actually big operations in philanthropy that have no strings attached to them. More importantly, we actually try to measure who gets flexible funding because of the sector that they operate in, or because of the type of organization that they are. So the first example is the type of organization that is least likely to receive flexible funding are research institutions, universities. And why? Because donors don't want to pay for their fixed costs. They only want to pay for the research because it's sexier, it's nicer to be able to put your name in, I supported this research, but I don't want to maintain your lab. Then you also have, but in general, if you see like the upper part of the chart on the right, everybody has a very low probability of receiving flexible funding. But it's interesting that most of the organizations in this sample that actually receive flexible funding are actually NGOs in developing countries. So that's a little bit paradoxical. You would say, like, if those organizations that are quite far away are actually those that receive flexible funding, then what is happening here? What is the trust issue actually a problem? It turns out that those are the ones who receive the least funding. So they receive very small grants with very low risk. And all of the larger grants actually go with a lot of strings attached to other sectors. This also varies a lot by sector. So we found that there are projects in agriculture that are the ones least likely to receive general funding. I don't know why. If you have any idea of some of the answers that can be behind this graph, I would love to chat with you, because I think there's a lot to exploit and understand better. More importantly, when we started doing this work, I remember it took us 2 years to clean the data to be able to do this work. So this is why it's very slow. When we actually did it, we realized, like, oh my God, we need to be able to know more about this, because every time we answered a question, we kind of came up with a better one, but we needed to collect more data for that. So we said, like, hey, let's look at the US foundations, because their data is easily accessible and you can compare them through time, and you can tell a story not about the funding that is flexible, but about which donors are flexible. And more importantly, which donors are changing, which are becoming more flexible or which are becoming less flexible. So here we did a comparison through time of 3 organizations that have very interesting stories to tell on flexible funding. The first one is the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation was one of the biggest, became one of the biggest flexible funders in the world very recently, in 2016. They just made a pledge that most of their work was actually going to be flexible, and they actually followed with that. Most of their funding really became much more general purpose. Then you have others, for instance, that are like Good Ventures, who have a different story, because at the beginning, and this is the chart on the top, they had a lot of flexible funding, but it was provided to very few organizations because they were building those grantees. They were building their capacities. They were building those organizations so that later on they could actually deploy all of that funding. So it sometimes doesn't even make sense to talk about multi-year flexible funding, because sometimes what you want to do is you do early year unrestricted funding until the organization has the capacity. And then when they have the capacity, then you actually give them a lot of funding to be able to deploy. and you give it through earmark grants. That's a perfectly legitimate strategy. And you see it right there playing out. And then you have others who sometimes have the intention of going much more flexible, but not necessarily doing as quickly as they can. So for instance, you can see that the Kellogg Foundation, which is the one on the right, is the organization that only managed to become flexible because of COVID. They tried, they've had ups and downs, but COVID was the thing that made them flexible. When we did this analysis, we actually measured to what extent the portfolios of these foundations has been moving towards less flexibility or more flexibility. And what you see here often is that there are donors who are completely not flexible by default. That's how they work. And that's perfectly legitimate. They know something about what they do that necessarily means that all of their grants have to have strings attached, complicated contracts. They can be related to research, to energy sectors, or whatever it is. There are others who have this twofold strategy. I'm flexible at the beginning, but I become less flexible afterwards because now you have the capacity to deploy these multiple projects. And then you need actually those contracts. You don't need general support funding. And then there are these others who, for instance, face the shock of COVID, and that forced them to realize that they were putting absurd restrictions into the way they work, and they could loosen up. They could make their own lives easier, their grantees' lives easier, and everybody could work better there. Is this a trend? Is this really a trend in the sector? Is the entire philanthropic sector becoming more flexible or less flexible? And here, I'm sorry to tell you that I don't know the answer to the question, because as of 2021, 2022, when we finished the data collection for the study, a lot of things were changing. There was a change basically in how much funding was actually going up flexibly, but we don't know whether these trends actually reverted back. We don't know whether donors went to their old ways and started doing, or as also Arjun mentioned in his presentation, some actually do have the intention to carry these new practices for the rest of their work. So we don't know right now if these changes are permanent or if these changes are going to go back to normal. So I'm be very happy if somebody actually picks up this question, because I think it's fascinating. It's important to keep track of. So just to summarize, for those of you who didn't read the paper, those are having lunch, these were the findings of the paper. Number one, flexible funding is an exception. It's not the rule. The entire sector operates in a way that combines flexible and inflexible funding. There is a proportion, and there's quite a bit of flexible funding available, but most of it is not. And strings are attached. And the reason is what I've just mentioned, contractual relationships between donors and grantees that I think, and my hypothesis is that those exist just to make their lives easier and the contracting work much kind of aligned into the interests of the donors and the grantees. There's very little ground for thinking that we live in the world of the extremes where every donor gives basically like all that you do this with these funds for this, for that, tomorrow or the day after that, you can only do this. And then the world of like, hey, here you go. Here's $20 million for the next 5 years. Do with that whatever the hell you want. Those worlds are caricatures and we should ignore them. There's a combination, a mixture of earmarked funding and unearmarked funding from every donor. And we need to be able to understand why that mixture works instead of just asking for caricatures. It turns out that small organizations are the ones that receive flexible funding, but they receive very little. And the reason, as I mentioned, is that probably that's how trust building works. That's a process of understanding how the process of building trust, repeating, rinse and repeat, getting a reputation, learning from each other, that's how it actually works. And that there are some donors, the example there was the Ford Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, Yield Giving, who are either moving towards a flexible by default. So for instance, a lot of foundations, just to simplify their lives, they have standard grant agreement contracts. So a lot of what they're actually doing is they're changing their defaults. They're changing their templates. So their templates are not those super long contracts, but they're much more streamlined and they're shorter and less clauses and less more flexibility for them and for their donors. So I'm not sure in terms of time. I need Arthur, if you can just flag me, like Nelson.
Yeah, I think Nelson I think that sometimes is up if we want to have a conversation, but you're welcome to maybe conclude in 1 minute or
Yes.
so.
So I'm going to skip this, but I think that ultimately my main message is this one. We need to understand contracts. We really need to understand the nitty-gritty of the conditions. The world between completely flexible and not flexible, it doesn't matter that much. I can happily make these slides available for everybody afterwards. But I do think that we need to reframe the questions into these. We need to understand what's happening with these organizations who are much more attractive to receive flexible funding, and they're not leaving a lot of space for new organizations to be born out of this. When is flexible funding more important? In what part of the year and what part of the project cycle? This is much more important, much more practical information for the donors. Objectives. Are these organizations who do 30 things at the same time less likely to receive funding because donors can't trust them to misallocate funding from one thing to another? Important. Intermediaries, reputation, signaling. So I think we need to move towards these questions are answerable. These questions, we can research them. These questions are, I think, much more valuable to spend our time trying to discuss and much more constructive. So the takeaways that I started with is that you really need to ask the right questions. And I don't think the trust-based philanthropy movement is asking the right questions or even giving the right answers. We need to be going a little bit deeper, a little bit more precise, and really don't only kind of be okay with scratching the surface. We also need to be able to know that there are a lot of answers to these questions that are not satisfactory. I remember reading a bit of that report that came out on yield giving and the capacities of their grantees, and I realized that it was very problematic. The study is biased in so many ways that unfortunately I don't have time to explain today, but it's very problematic. It's almost like it's a study that was created to justify the existence of that model. And I don't find that research believable whatsoever. So I think it's important to be able to scrutinize this. And the other part is I think that donors need to be able to contribute to the answer of these questions. So if researchers reach out to you, give them your time, pay attention to them, tell them what your concerns, your worries about, why are you flexible? Defend your way of working, because every foundation has its own way of working, and it's important for them to be able to explain it because it comes from that. So I hope that you kind of walk away from this conversation a little bit more with a different perspective, a much more empirical perspective maybe of this, and a much more practical one. And also with the main point of we need to start moving towards answering the questions that really matter and basically not get distracted with the questions that don't. So thank you for your attention, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nelson, and for this very insightful presentation. Thank you again to Ariane as well. I think we will have now questions for both of you. So I think there was already one question in the chat that was a question from Cyrielle about your views, Nelson, and maybe Ariane, you can chime in as well, about results-based funding instruments where the funding is tied to outcomes and not to specific activities. Do we have data on that, and how does it relate to unrestricted funding? Maybe that would be the right angle for that.
RJ, would you like to go, or can I go first?
No, go ahead. It's directed to you, the question.
So I think when we looked at the OECD database to see how many, we looked at it very specifically to look at one type of results-based model, which was social impact bonds, right? So there's an entire financing model where, if you're familiar with it, I won't have time to explain today, but it's a type of result-based frame. And when we actually measured how much funding in the $40 billion that we had in our database, how much funding was results-based? It was 12 million. So it was homeopathic, like the smallest amount. And I think the largest social impact bond that I've seen so far financed by Philanthropy is a $40 million operation. So it's just not big enough. They're like, why this is the case? I'm not entirely sure, but I do think that my impression is that a lot of results-based outcomes have a lot of intermediary organizations that need to validate whether those outcomes actually were realized. And this becomes you start involving a lot of people into very simple operations. And sometimes foundations just say, like, I'm sorry, but I rather work in a much more simple way than involving 30 auditors and surveyors and everybody who's actually figuring out whether that actually works. But I don't have a very satisfactory, like a very good answer on that. I think it's an important question.
Can I add to that? Or yeah, so
yeah, just a few points on that.
Yeah, so I think it is really important, and I think I already mentioned that in my presentation for a little bit, to not confuse outcomes with impact. And that's what often happens, right? So I'm also always a bit skeptical about output-based projects. Because the output is not, I mean, it really depends, of course, right? What the project is and what the context is and so forth. And it also actually relates to the other question that was put in the chat on due diligence and M&E. Yeah, I think monitoring and evaluation of impact is really hard. So we also, as researchers and as practitioners, have to be modest actually about what we can say about impact. That's really hard, there is no second world in which, there is a counterfactual in which we didn't give this specific type of funding. So there's never a good comparison group. I mean, sometimes there is randomized controlled trials, and we all know Bill Gates with his malaria programs, and that's great. So sometimes it is possible to do some kind of randomized experiments and to say something about causal effects. But again, if you work on wicked problems, on the environment or on poverty, it's really hard to, to disentangle the effects of specific projects and programs. So maybe we have to start with being modest about that.
Yeah, thank you for this, these great points. We have, I think, another question by Marie-Stéphane about I think it's easier if you say it out loud, Marie-Stéphane, because I think it's quite long.
Thank you. Well, as you know, Nelson, I'm working a lot on trust. Yeah, I wanted to know that because in the conclusion of your report, you were saying that flexible funding is frequently described as the result of a relationship of trust between a philanthropic donor and a beneficiary. And I wanted to know if, to your opinion, if this flexible and multi-year funding is a necessary or sufficient condition to build trust between the two partners. And if you have seen, and it's a question to Arjun as well, other mechanism that can lead or that can consolidate this relationship of trust between the two partners.
That is a very, very good question. I do think that in this trust building circle, now that we understand much better how this whole story of trust actually works, there is a role to play in flexible funding there for sure. And in the sense of basically delegating a lot of agency to the organization who receives the funds, basically to test out and continue to build that trust, just to test how that relationship can accomplish many things. Because ultimately, what I understand in the sector is that donors and grantees kind of meet together to be able to do things that they're both interested in. But they most of the time need to discover how that works instead of actually assuming that you are the right person for this and I am the right person for that. So it's almost like an exercise of dating. You're just discovering each other, and you need to be able to build that relationship, and then you can go to the next steps, and you can evolve it, and it can last for decades. Sometimes they just break up. You just find yourself in, I'm sorry, but we are probably not the right organization, and they break up, and it's not you, it's me, or whatever the excuse. But I do think that that the idea of flexible funding can play a part in trust building. It could be one of those risky propositions from the side of donor to be able to learn whether they can actually trust their partners. But I think donors are quite risk averse, and this is why this happens with this preferential attachment happens. They prefer to already go and fund an organization that is already well established than to actually learn how to work with somebody new. And I think that's a problem in the sector, because I think it stifles innovation. It creates a bunch of additional problems. But to that, I don't have a solution. But I'd be happy to have a kind of another conversation on that particular point, because I do think that the most interesting questions about this topic are still unanswered, and I hope that we can all work together to come closer to better answers.
Can I add?
Yeah, please, Ariane. Thank you, Nelson.
In our interviews, we asked respondents, so yeah, how did you spend this unrestricted funding from the postcode lottery? And it was really striking that some said, yeah, we use it for our programs because that's what it's intended for, right? And others said, receiving the same type of grants, yeah, no, we put it in our organization because that's what it's intended for, right? So the very same funder, the very same grant was perceived widely different between partner organizations. And that was so interesting because the postcode lottery is in its whole philosophy trust-based. It says it is. But then still, grantees are looking for what they think that the donor wants. And this power imbalance is so persistent. Even a funder that from its foundation actually is kind of trust-based in its grant-making strategy, still encounters these expectations and ideas and norms among grantees. So it's a good starting point to be aware of these maybe implicit ideas about what partners think about each other and think that the other wants. So I really liked Nelson's figure of this trust building thing, that it's a cycle and things reinforce each other. So yeah.
Thank you both for this. I think we are running a little bit out of time because we have a few minutes to conclude. But I just wanted to again thank Nelson and Ariane a lot for their presentations. We also shared a few resources in the chat, so you can have a look at it in the chat. We also will share the slides if both Ariane and Nelson are okay with it, but I think Nelson already proposed that. So thank you again very much to both our speakers for this conversation that indeed needs to be continued. And I really enjoyed how Nelson, you outlined the future research questions, basically for either scholars or independent researchers to address. So thanks again for that. Before we wrap things up, just 3 quick news about the Philanthropy Chair at ESSEC. So we have a new podcast episode, which is in English, which is not always the case in our podcast series, about food and philanthropy, and more precisely, the resilience of food systems and how can philanthropy contribute to that, with Estelle Paulus from the University of Oxford, who spent who spent a few months with us at ESSEC as a visiting fellow. Speaking of trust-based philanthropy, we wrote a chapter with Marie-Stéphane, Anne Karpash, and myself in this new book, which was edited by our colleagues from the University of Geneva, Philanthropy, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. Our colleague Anne Monnier also wrote a chapter on the climate crisis and philanthropy. So you're welcome to check this book, because it's also an open access book, which is rare enough in academia and academic publishing to be mentioned. So all the chapters are currently available for downloading and reading for free. So please, have a look. The link is in the chat. And I would like also to invite you to our last event before the summer, which will be a book launch and a meeting with Jérôme Koller, who just published a book in French called La main qui donne, an essay about philanthropy and the social contract, and how it can be rethought in the age of the environmental crisis in particular. So this is all for today. Again, big thank you to Nelson and Ariane for this very stimulating conversation. I hope we have other opportunities to further this dialogue. Good luck for your respective projects. And I would like to thank everyone for this webinar, which was the last for the year before the summer. So again, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.